Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Yonit Arthur. I'm an audiologist and coach. You're on the Steady Coach. Today, I'm going to be talking about what tools actually do work to help you recover from neural circuit symptoms when you've tried a bunch of stuff and none of it seems to be working. Maybe you've tried neuroplasticity programs, you've tried self compassion, you've gone to therapy, you've done specific training programs for chronic pain or other symptoms, you've listened to tons of YouTube videos, and you're still stuck. So, in the previous video in this series, I actually explained a little more about why you're stuck. We're going to go into that just a little bit more today. But in this video, I'm primarily going to focus on 4 things that you actually can do to help get yourself unstuck and continue making progress in your recovery. This video is for anyone with neural circuit symptoms. So, I focused primarily on neural circuit dizziness. So, medically unexplained chronic dizziness symptoms, PPPD, MdDS, vestibular migraine, cervicogenic dizziness, post-concussion syndrome. But this also applies to those of you with other multisensory syndrome type situations, visual snow syndrome, complex migraine, functional neurologic disorder, etc. And really anyone out there who has medically unexplained chronic symptoms that are from a brain processing issue rather than tissue damage. So, before we jump into what tools to use, first of all, if you're new, welcome. Please watch the first video in this series so this one makes sense. And also, if you can hit the subscribe button, that really helps make sure I reach more people and also will help notify you when I put out the next video in this series. Also, before I get started, I want to comment on the previous video because there were 2 points that seemed to be misunderstood. I saw in the comment section lots of questions about this. So I'm going to clarify those really quickly before we move on. First of all, many people seem to interpret my first video in this series, which, by the way, is called Why These Tools Aren't Working to Help You Recover Simple and Actionable. I'll link to it in the video description, but you can also search for it on YouTube. Many people who watched that video seemed to misinterpret what I was saying to mean that everyone who's in stage 3 or 4 needs a coach or a therapist. And that is absolutely not correct. Now, while I would love for everyone to have a really highly skilled coach or therapist, I understand that that's simply not possible for many reasons. And I want you to know that I have absolutely seen people in stages 3 and 4 recover without having to pay someone to help them. So, my main point in that first video was to explain why the goals and aims are different when you have stage 3 or 4 symptoms. We're going to talk about what I mean by that in a second. So, hang in there. So, again, regardless of what support system you have, you need to know your goals and what's actually going on in your stress bucket are different when you have a more high level presentation, shall we say. Speaking of which, the second thing that people seem to misinterpret was that what I said in the first video was that the contents of your bucket determine what stage you're in. I just roughly made stages 1 through 4 to help explain the concept. The stage you're in has nothing to do with the intensity of your symptoms. I have seen people with super intense 24/7 symptoms be stuck in bed and not be in stage 3. They are in stage 1 and 2. And the way that we know the difference is when someone's in stage 1 and 2, they just need to learn the information. They need to start calming the fear. They need to react differently to their symptoms. They need to be more self compassionate. They need to maybe engage in some habit change. Those people, their buckets drain pretty easily when they do those things. So they just get better. So the whole point of having stages 3 and 4, that whole concept is to explain why those things that I just mentioned don't work for everyone and why some of you are like experts in doing all of the things I just described and you still find yourselves stuck. So if you find yourself stuck despite having done a lot of these things, this video is going to help explain what you actually can do and will hopefully explain some of the nuances that maybe have been missed that will help you get unstuck and accelerate your recovery. So, quick recap. We talked in the first video about how there are different kinds of stress in your bucket. And I broadly categorize them, again, just to make the concept simple, but not because you have to know exactly what kind of stress is in your bucket. Light stress is situational stress, work stress. This stuff drains out of your bucket relatively easily because it doesn't create a ton of danger and uncertainty. Medium stress, things like perfectionism, longstanding habits, these things amplify stress. They make stress worse. They create more uncertainty and danger, so they're stickier. They're a little harder to drain. And finally, dense stressors, which in the first video I called pressure cooker type stressors. These are things like trauma and core beliefs that really affect everything. They create a ton of uncertainty and danger in response to all kinds of stress. And even without stress present, they're very sticky. They're really hard to drain. So, the relative proportion of the different kinds of stress in your bucket are what determine what stage you're in. If most of it is light stress, you can do habit change and self compassion, and the bucket will drain. But if most of it's dense stress or medium stress, you need different tools because your stress is sticky. Okay, so now we're going to talk about a nuance that we didn't cover in the first video. In the real world, not only does new stress pour into your bucket, but your bucket creates its own stress. And the type of stress in your bucket doesn't just determine how sticky the stress is, it also determines what happens to all that new and self generated stress. So let's break this down. First of all, buckets create their own stress. Don't believe me? You have symptoms. Are the symptoms stressful? Yes. Is your brain generating them? Yes. That's extra stress that your symptoms are pouring into your bucket that is separate from just life stressors. Those of you out there who are giant perfectionists, your bucket creates its own stress. People pleasers, your bucket creates its own stress. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more because the second thing I said is even more important. What's already in your bucket determines what happens to all that stress, the new stress and the self generated stress. Let me show you. So here's a bucket that has mostly light stress in it. These are a lot of the people you see in the YouTube comments whose symptoms came on after a series of life stressors, and they just get better by using the standard treatment techniques that everyone in the neuroplastic world talks about because their buckets can drain and because that little filter you see on top of the bucket, when new stress comes in, when the bucket creates its own stress, it doesn't make that stress worse. It just passes through, it stays light stress, easily drainable. Now take a look at this bucket. This is someone who has a lot more medium and dense stress. There's a lot more going on when new and self generated stress pour into the bucket. That filter on top reflects what's already in the bucket, meaning that when new stress comes in, it's amplified, it's made more dense, it gets stickier. When self generated stress pours back into the bucket, it also gets stickier and more dense. So the bucket fills itself with stickier and stickier material over time, making it harder and harder to drain. I call this bucket rigid. It's not elastic, it's rigid. It's full of sticky material that's hard to drain. This is why those standard treatments or those standard self help methods aren't working. Your stress is stickier, so you need something that's going to unstick that stress. Let me explain with an example, going back to our example of you potentially being a giant perfectionist. So, when you encounter a work deadline, for example, that's new stress that pours through that filter and it becomes stickier because you're going to feel the work stress much more acutely than someone who isn't a perfectionist. You're going to feel pressure to be perfect in response to this work deadline. But your bucket's also creating its own perfectionist stress where there isn't stress at all because you probably feel pressure to be perfect even when there isn't something that you must do or when there's stress actually being applied from the outside. And it becomes a what I call recursive cycle. Your bucket generates its own stress and then it passes through that perfectionist filter, which means that it creates even more pressure or more dense, sticky material. Perfectionists don't respond to symptoms the way that non perfectionists do. Perfectionists will often respond to symptoms by wanting to do somatic tracking perfectly or feeling personally responsible for feeling ill. That's extra sticky stress that fills your bucket. So now let's move on to what actually works. And in order to explain what works, I want to just give you a quick overview of what doesn't work because many of you have tried these things. So, education is the most important thing for people whose buckets aren't full of sticky stress because it actually helps the bucket drain. The bucket is relatively flexible. That new information, the brain can take it in and say, oh, let me update. Let me update all of my maps. Let me update all my predictions. We're good. They get better, their buckets drain. When you have stickier stress in your bucket, that cognitive knowledge, that information just doesn't unstick some of these threat predictions that your brain is stuck in. Somatic tracking. It is really helpful to people in stages 1 and 2 because they have the capacity to be maybe neutral or playful with their sensations. That may not be possible for you. And also, I am aware that although I said at the beginning of this video, symptoms are not what tells me whether your bucket is flexible or not. What I can tell you is that for people who are dealing with the kinds of symptoms I typically work with, like dizziness, visual symptoms, rocking, bobbing, I mean, those kinds of really distressing multisensory symptoms, their buckets are more rigid by default because the symptoms themselves are medium and dense stressors. They're very, very disorienting. They make buckets more rigid. So when you try to do somatic tracking with symptoms like those, and you're already in a state of total panic, it can be a lot harder to implement somatic tracking as most people describe it. Exposure. In stages 1 and 2, where the bucket is relatively flexible, just doing exposure helps your brain learn, hey, these situations aren't dangerous. I need to rewire. Things look a little bit different when your bucket's more rigid, and I'm going to explain my take later in this video. And then finally, I get questions about this all the time. Avoidance behaviors. So, a lot of times people in the neuroplastic world are advised, hey, don't do somatic tracking or graded exposure, etc., when your symptoms are super high and distressing. And this does make sense if your symptoms have peaks and valleys. But many of you who have very rigid buckets, your triggers are super unpredictable. Your symptoms may be 10 out of 10 all the time. So, if we are constantly having you monitor how high your symptoms are and then make decisions about whether you're going to do exposure at these various times or not, that can hold you back and actually increase fear. So, what works if you suspect your bucket is rigid and inflexible, because now we've explained that that's actually what's happening, that's the real problem. What we need to do that actually works is simply make your bucket more flexible. We need to loosen up some of these denser and medium level stressors. And there are 4 general principles that I'm going to talk to you about today. The first is that symptoms are messages, not errors. The second is that you need to update your system through experience, not counteraction, which I will define and explain. You need to approach exposure as self attachment, which I will also explain. And then you need to expand your bucket. So, first of all, let's talk about the symptoms being messages, not errors. You will hear me refer to symptoms as errors all the time. And what I mean by that is symptoms are neurological errors. Your brain is misunderstanding, misappraising the sensory information it's getting. That's true. But we want to think of these symptoms as actually quite useful because if you just tell yourself you're safe and the symptoms are just errors, you've probably noticed if your bucket is rigid, that doesn't do anything for you. You do not feel safer. The symptoms don't go down. But your symptoms actually tell you a whole lot about your brain's general predictions about danger. In other words, when we reframe your symptoms as messages, it is actually a cheat code for helping you find out exactly what predictions, what deeper maps, what specific things your brain finds dangerous that you can actually update to help make your bucket more flexible and cause your brain to stop responding with so much threat and uncertainty to everything. Yes, everyone's brain finds scary sensations dangerous, but you're also going to find other beliefs activating in response to the symptoms. Some examples: if I don't perform, I'll be abandoned. If I slow down, I'll become irrelevant. If I let this feeling rise, I'll be overwhelmed. I'm not strong enough to handle this. I have to be in control, otherwise, everything will descend into chaos. These are core beliefs. These are core maps about what your brain thinks are dangerous. And this is exactly the kind of stuff that we need to update to help make your bucket less rigid. So, practically, here's how you can start getting to these maps. The next time you attempt to somatic track, don't try to be neutral. I want you to actually notice the beliefs and feelings that are activating when you are somatic tracking. Say to yourself, I allow my reactions to be here. And then see if you can separate from those reactions just a smidge by observing them. I, Yonit, observe that there is a part of me reacting to this symptom with overwhelming fear, for example. Notice the parts in your body, notice them in your mind, notice the feelings that come with them. Everyone experiences these things differently, but most importantly, I want you to make it as much of a multi-sensory experience as you can. The more imagination you use, the more real it becomes to the parts of your brain that we're trying to update. Write these down. These are your signposts. These are the signposts that point you directly to what you need to do to recover. Second, many of the techniques that you see online are counteractive, meaning they create new maps, new ways of being, but they don't update old maps. And in order to help your bucket become more elastic, less rigid, we actually need to update those old maps that are causing your brain to assume everything is threatening and bad and dangerous. Reframing symptoms as safe, self compassion, being indifferent to symptoms, positive self talk, affirmations, habit change. These are all useful techniques, but they don't work very well when your system is rigid because, again, they're creating new maps, not updating old ones, and we need to update the old ones. Fortunately for you, there is an entire body of research on exactly how to do this. It's called memory reconsolidation. I have an interview with Dr. Tori Olds on my YouTube channel that I'll also link to in the video description, in which we go into great detail on exactly what this is. But to make it really simple, you have to actually feel and fully activate these beliefs, these sensations, these emotions that are causing the old maps to stay stuck. They need to be fully active. And at the same time, your brain has to have an experience that directly contradicts it. So, where most people mess up or get stuck here is as soon as that old feeling starts to come up and get activated, they immediately try to shut it down by reassuring or providing self compassion or whatever. Again, that counteracts, that builds up that new map, but both maps need to be fully active in order to make this change happen. What that means for you practically is fully allowing. I know many of you are big fans of Sam Miller. I'm going to, of course, link to her YouTube channel in the video description because she talks about allowing a lot. But allowing is just a way of describing actively listening to what your system is saying and allowing those old beliefs and patterns and feelings to fully rise up because that's the only way they can be updated. I'm going to have a full video on exactly this topic as the third video in this series, so definitely stay tuned for that. For now, you may have already written down or at least thought about some of these signposts or maps I referred to when I explained the first principle. And your job is to essentially start getting yourself to fully feel them with curiosity, because curiosity is a juxtaposing experience, meaning curiosity already makes your brain go on alert. Because generally, what's happening with these kinds of maps is you're avoiding them. They're scary, they're bad, they're predictions about threat. So your brain expects you to run away screaming. When you respond with some amount of curiosity, being willing to feel them purposely, your brain says, wait a second, that doesn't make sense. Those aren't what my expectations were. Maybe we should take a look at that map and update it. That's what you want. Third, exposure and engagement. This is how I think about it when the bucket is rigid. You're not doing exposures to rewire your brain by exposing yourself to triggers. Yes, sort of. But the real point, in my opinion, is to model safety. And safety isn't what you say, oh, okay, it's okay that I do this. Yonit said that my brain will rewire, especially when your bucket's rigid. Safety is what you do. Safety is what you feel. And safety doesn't mean you don't feel fear. Safety actually doesn't mean you feel safe either. You may feel absolutely horrendous at all times. You may feel full of fear. But when you show up for yourself reliably and consistently, that is the message of safety. So, this advice that you've probably heard to create a routine and stick to it, it's not just for the purpose of rewiring your brain. You showing up for yourself consistently and reliably is a felt, experienced message of safety that gets deep to the core of many of the issues that are probably leading your bucket to be rigid. Most of you who have rigid buckets have poor relationships with yourself. And showing up for yourself reliably and consistently by doing micro exposures, by sticking to a routine, is a felt experience that can start to repair that poor relationship. Success in graded exposure when you have a rigid bucket does not mean that you don't feel fear, as I already said. What it means is that you are able to relate to fear directly when it happens. This is more than you just allowing fear to be there or being passive or accepting it or floating through it. This is naming it, feeling it, maybe even inviting it to come along for the ride. Speaking of fear, another nuance here, you don't want to reassure yourself a lot when you have a rigid bucket. And I'm aware that this may fluctuate. I provide a ton of reassurance on my channel. It's super important when someone first finds neuroplastic symptoms. So, especially if you're new to symptoms, get all the reassurance you need. But if you've been going through this and you've not gotten better, or you notice reassurance doesn't stick, like you reassure yourself or someone else reassures you, and then 2 minutes later you feel worse, reassurance is reinforcing some of these maps. When you have a rigid bucket, reassurance reinforces threat predictions and danger mode. It does not make it better. So you need to replace it with allowing the fear to be there. So think about it. It makes sense, actually. When you feel bad and someone's like, no, you don't, everything's fine. If you're not feeling super, super, super bad, that may actually land. But if you're feeling really deeply scared about something and someone just kind of reassures you offhandedly, that's not necessarily going to make you feel better. And in fact, you may feel totally misunderstood and misheard, right? That's kind of what's happening here when your bucket is rigid. So you say to yourself, yes, there is a part of me that is experiencing deep terror. I am going to allow that part of me to be here. I'm here with it. We will feel it together. And finally, we need to expand the bucket. When you have a rigid bucket, your capacity is particularly low, especially since your bucket's creating all sorts of new stress and it's turning older stress into newer stress that's stickier and all that stuff. So this is where lifestyle and routine stuff actually do become important, and I'm aware that in the neuroplastic world, people are kind of allergic to that because they're worried people are going to obsessively start doing physical things when the problem is stress and the mind and neuroplastic issues. But sticking to a routine, getting exercise if you can, sunlight, waking up, going to bed at the same time, good nutrition. I know these may not all be possible for you depending on what your symptoms are and where you're at, but every little thing, I want you to think of just expanding your bucket by another inch. And that means that you have the capacity to deal with some of this stickier stress that's being poured into it right now. Okay, so I hope this was helpful for those of you who have felt stuck. This video packed so much information into one video. I would highly recommend watching it again and taking notes. I could go into any of these topics at length, and it would be a 4-hour long video, so I'm not going to do that. But I am, as I said, planning a third video in this series specifically on the topic of allowing and my take on how to do it and how maybe to do it in pretty plain language for those of you who have trouble with meditation or mindfulness practices. So please stay tuned for that. And in the meantime, I'd love to hear your questions and comments. Drop them below. Please like the video, share it, subscribe to my channel. And as always, thank you so much for being here. My goal is to reach as many people as possible, especially those of you who are stuck. You are my people. So keep watching for more content specifically for you. All right. Take care, everyone. We'll talk soon. Bye.